All right, welcome to video 2. And in this video, I am going to talk about 3 different articles in light of the paradigms that they represent. This is where we ended talking about constructivism, and these were the questions that were meant to guide the discussion that we were going to have in class today. And we may touch on some of these in class next week, in particular because I think the paradigms, the critical theory and the constructivist paradigm are sort of challenging because they're not traditional ways of understanding science and understanding what we can know and how we can know it. So those questions are, what paradigm does the article represent and how do we know? What ontological and epistemological positions does the article take and how do we know? What is the main argument of the knowledge and what are the research questions? How is the study designed and what research methods are used? What are the main findings? All right, so we're going to start with the Aleman article. And Aleman is an article that's very clearly an example of critical theory. And we can see that because of the assumptions that the author makes about power and the interaction between race and power and the influence that intersection has on the inequitable funding system here in Texas, with which I'm sure you are all familiar. We also know this because the author was actively participating in the legislative process, trying to shape the outcome and to make it more equitable. So again, there's that purpose for critical theory, that we're not just here to sort of uncover knowledge, but really here to try to transform outcome and have different outcomes. So the article is overtly activist and ideological. He talks very openly about race and racism as normal and pervasive throughout society. And then finally, we know that it's critical theory because he explicitly asks what stories are privileged and what stories and narratives are marginalized. So again, there's that purpose of critical theory, trying to uncover those marginalized or oppressed voices and bring them to the fore. So again, we know that it's CRT because he uses the interview process to essentially try to convince his participants that the system is racist and that they need to take action. He's trying to change their minds. 2, what ontological and epistemological positions does your article take and how do you know? So the ontological position is between material and ideal because it assumes that there are different ways of knowing and seeing, and adopts a perspective that privileges research grounded in the experiences and knowledge of people of color. So traditionally, as we talked about, critical theory adopts a position of historical realism. So there is something real and we can know it, but that something real is not sort of the natural order of things, but rather the result of these different power struggles going on. And so what he's saying here is there are different ways of knowing, and traditionally research favors or privileges ways of knowing that are that carry a certain level of power and oppress other ways of knowing. So the traditional ways of knowing tend to be practiced by people who are white and privileged, and that people who are people of color and people from marginalized communities may have different ways of knowing. And he's specifically seeking to put those forward. The epistemological position is one of understanding the content of discourse and the shaping of discourse, and the role that values and politics play in shaping understanding. How is the central problem of the article defined? So the central problem is the source of interested in understanding the source of the inequitable funding system in Texas and the role that race and power play in perpetuating what he describes as a fundamentally inequitable system. So again, this ties everything ties back to the fact that he's taking a critical race approach. the way he defines the problem, and then the way that the research questions are also, the way that the research questions are framed. So what assumptions does the article make about the problem, and how are those assumptions informed by the paradigm that he adopts? The article assumes that the system is racist in its intent and its design. And that's important. That's very important to note, because oftentimes people will grant that something, a policy perhaps, is racist, problematic in its implementation or in its consequences, but that it was not designed to be that way. You see this, for example, with voter laws. And Aleman is arguing, no, this system was created to be this way, and it's created to be this way to privilege white and wealthy children and to hurt brown and black children and poor children. This article assumes that through the reframing of the system and the problem, that we can see new solutions that would be more equitable. And through his conversations with the superintendents, he hopes to move their positions and help them see that they are not, that they are victims of the system, and that there is something they can do to fix it. How does the paradigm guide the choice of methods, i.e. the research design, the data collection, and the data analysis, in the article, as well as the discussion and the implication of the findings? So the sample is 8 Mexican-American superintendents from South Texas. Then the methods were 2 in-depth interviews with superintendents. And the thing that's key here is, again, these conversations are seen as an opportunity to move the superintendents, to transform their views. And what he, in the end, concludes is that they've sort of been captured by the system, and that maybe they see that it's inequitable. They don't necessarily agree that it's purposeful in its intent, but they certainly don't agree that there's much that can be done about it. All right, second article. And I will note that I believe the questions that I'm using to guide my reading are different than the questions I initially posed, and I apologize for that. These questions that I'm using here to parse these articles are really focused on the ontology and the epistemology, and I think the original questions I posed were more straightforward in terms of the findings and the methods. So this is our second article, Cochrane, Smith, and Fries, and this is an example of the interpretivist paradigm, and this is what we call a discourse analysis. So number one, what paradigms does it represent, and how do you know? Well, we know that it's interpretivist because the paper focuses on understanding the discourse, the way we talk about teacher preparation, and how those 2 sets of discourses are different and how they are constructed. So this is really about meaning making and trying to understand how this meaning was made. The authors explicitly note that they're not trying to argue that one is right or true. And of course, that is an important differentiation from critical theory, which would come out and say, nope, this one's right and this one's wrong. But rather, the purpose of the article is to argue that the different positions are constructed based on very different political beliefs and values. What ontological and epistemological positions does your article take, and how do you know? The authors do not claim to be able to know the truth. And of course, this suggests more of what we call an idealist ontology, so idealist coming from idea. And another way to think about that is it's a relativist epistemology. Their approach to learning about the 2 discourses is through contextualization and deep analysis of the language and the environment in which both discourses were incubated. So again, it's really about meaning making and deconstructing the meaning, and how the meaning is grounded in different sets of understandings about the way things are. How is the central problem of the article defined? So the central problem, what they're trying to understand, is the nature of these competing discourses. And any of you, having been in the classroom, all of you know that there is a big debate about teacher education. And, one saying that it's important and it's valuable, the traditional models of teacher education, and another saying teacher education is basically useless, it's a waste of time and taxpayer money, it doesn't work, and we should toss it out. And so what these authors are trying to understand is how do we get to those two polarized positions? What assumptions does the article make about the problem, and how are those assumptions informed by the paradigm that's adopted? So the authors assume that there's no one right way to think about the policy issue. And remember, they make a big deal out of, we're not taking sides, we're just breaking this down for you. They assume that both articles have underlying political and ideological beliefs that lead those arguments to be so divergent. And finally, how does the paradigm guide the choice of methods, i.e. the research design, the data collection, data analysis in the article, as well as the discussion of the implications of the findings? So they analyze, their data come from policy documents and texts, so those are the actual words, public speeches, and thinking about the context as well. This approach aligns with the purpose of understanding and identifying the way discourse is constructed, so trying to think about going back to the text and deconstructing where it comes from based on the context. And this approach is called discourse analysis, and this is the way we examine how different versions of the world are produced through text and talk. All right, I am going to kind of rush through these last ones to get through this in the last 3 minutes before 15 minutes hits. Keep it nice and short. So the last article obviously represents our last paradigm, which is post-positivism. And we know this in part because really from the purpose of the study, which is to reveal an underlying truth about the relationship between taking certain kinds of career and technical education courses and certain student outcomes. And what they're seeking is generalizability. In other words, the article, the study, the authors assume that there is an underlying true relationship that they can study through empirical observation. What ontological and epistemological positions does the article take, and how do you know? So the article doesn't take, they don't take any explicit position. And this is really typical for this kind of work, this traditional way to think about knowledge. They never say, well, we're post-positivists, whereas critical theorists and constructivists will often come out and say, we're taking this position. How is the central problem defined? So they really define it in terms of gaps in the literature. There's these 3 things that we don't know about yet, the role of course taking and college enrollment, course taking and dropout, and course taking and this issue of timing. What assumptions does the article make? So again, the problem is defined as a gap in our knowledge, as something that we can learn about. We're going to fill in that gap with new objective knowledge. And how does the paradigm guide the choice of methods? Well, the study leverages large, say, secondary pre-existing database, its data set, that contain data on observable student traits. So things, again, of this empirical nature, these things we can observe and measure. The articles assume that these measures and the statistical tests that they're going to use will get them closer to a true but probabilistic understanding of the relationships and the answer. So in Blackboard, if you have time, please address these 3 questions. Which paradigm do you relate to most and why? Which paradigm do you relate to least and why? And which paradigm, this is sort of the most important, which paradigm do you think you would be most appropriate for what you are interested in studying and why? And I have a thread in Blackboard that you can respond to. Finally, next week, the reading is posted on Blackboard, Gall and Borg, and then of course continuing your own reading. The focus for class next week is going to be breaking down the research process. We're going to talk about research problems, research purposes, and research questions. And you are going to start working on coming up with your own questions. Do not forget that assignment 1 there's a draft due in week 5 and the final is due in week 6. Please go through those resources that are in the course materials folder. I think you will find them useful.